He said something real wild, this TMM guy. Woo!
They're lying about evolution.
One of the biggest objections I run into when I'm having conversations with people, objections to the existence of God, is the evolution. They would hear slogans like, well, evolution has disproven Christianity.
How come I've never heard that slogan? It's entirely reasonable to see the evidence of evolution and conclude that the book of Genesis is not literally true, but I've never heard of anyone who stopped believing in God because they learned about evolution.
Well, let's look at it this way. Just because you never heard anyone doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Huh? Maybe I should talk like this on all my live streams. Well, I guess I'll do a critique about this guy talking like him. Well, the fact is, it depends on which God you believe in. Under the Christian view, TMM, if it's true that Jesus Christ took on humanity to die and resurrect and save the world, that's not possible if there's not a universal thing he can take on called humanity. Now, the consequences of evolution, TMM, is that there's no such thing as a universality of humanity or any other species because they're always in flux. If they're always in flux, Jesus Christ can't take on any universality of humanity, only take on a particular creature's humanity. So he's only saving himself, you see.
In my book, Darwin's Doubt, I discuss a problem that Darwin understood about his own theory, even in 1859 when he published The Origin of Species, and that is that the pattern of appearance of new forms of life in the fossil record does not match the branching tree pattern that he presented in The Origin of Species.
He also explains in the same book why this is the case. The fossil record is far from perfect. It's rare for any organism to end up as a fossil. There have to be very specific conditions in place so you don't get to see every organism preserved. For example, after a fossil layer is deposited, the top of it will erode before the next layer forms on top of it, making it look like there are evolutionary jumps from layer to layer. Chapter 9 of The Origin of Species is all about this.
Hold on a second, TMM. You got a bunch of problems here. First of all, the time in which a fossil is required to be formed, the time required for a fossil to be formed changes. There's rapidly created fossils, and from your view, there's long time created fossils. But you got a bigger problem here, bucko. You can't argue that evolution occurs, which is these transitions between species that are very slow through random mutation and changes in the population. If the claim is evolution happens at the population level, you can't find a singular rare species and say it's evidence of transition because it's against your argument about it being a population then. Now you're arguing you can cite and reference evolution happening at the singular individual level. So you have to, you know what I mean? So according to meet your own standards, you're going to have to find an entire population of fossils that show the similar place they're in to then interpolate that and be like, oh, that was a whole population of this thing that had similar features but different enough. But no, you don't. You find very rare, not even fully intact fossils or skeletons or bones. You know what I mean?
Based on the bones.
And then what you do is you go, look at that singular thing. I'm going to argue for the population level change based on the singular thing. That's not even proper induction, by the way. Proper induction is looking at a collection of particulars and then reducing to a generality. You're looking at one particular, two particulars. You don't have a set. You don't have a set of fossils to call them transition or to say that you're observing evolution. You bunch of liars.
But instead, in the fossil record, new forms of life arise very abruptly.
Darwin explains that imperfections in the fossil record just make it look like they arise very abruptly more often than this actually happens.
And
he doesn't know that? Is that, TMM, is that scientific? Oh, Darwin says that they look like it. Well, they could look like a lot of things. You could look at an observation and it could look like a lot of things.
And there's one particular such event in the history of life that's especially dramatic. It's known as the Cambrian explosion.
The increase in the presence of fossils in the Cambrian layer is at least partly explained by the evolution of shells. They are much more likely to fossilize than the soft-bodied worm.
The evolution of shells? It's amazing. They think that's an explanation. How do you explain the evolution of this? Well, that's explained by the evolution of the other thing that I need an explanation for. That one evolutionary explanation, you can't just posit a new thing called the evolution of shells, because that's the thing in question, bucko.
Most of the first animals arise during the Cambrian period, and these first animals exemplify very new ways of arranging body parts and tissues called a body plan. On my shelf here, I've got a Trilobite fossil. And this particular one has very well preserved Trilobite eyes. The Trilobites, one of the earliest Cambrian animals, came on the scene already with sophisticated compound eyes. You can see the compound eyes like the eyes of modern insects. We know those are very sophisticated.
Dude, look at those eyeballs. Imagine having those for a day.
Devices. They are there from the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion.
Their fossils are there from the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. Because the animals that actually fossilize are a very tiny sample of all of the organisms that existed, we can't tell how long it took for the eyes to evolve.
You don't even know how they evolve. What are you talking about? You can't tell how long. You can't even explain how an eye comes to be from not an eye, dude. We can't even tell how long. We can't tell how long anything required to evolve. We just have to presuppose it and assume that it took that long. That is what we do. We are smart. We're atheists. These creation tards are so stupid. We don't even actually know how anything evolved mechanically. We just know that it did. We don't know how long either. We just know that it took a long time. We're smart.
They were likely there, developing very gradually since long before the Cambrian.
What does that mean, developing gradually? That is not an explanation, TMM. You can't just say developing. How does an eye develop gradually? That's the thing in question. Okay. Oh, you told a story. Cool. Tell me how the story actually occurred inside the chapters. Well, it did happen. I'm just going to write the chapter title over and over again. The chapter title is Eyes Evolved Over a Long Period of Time. Chapter 1, the eyes evolved over a long period of time. Let's get into the chapter. Eyes evolved a long period of time. Like, dude, you're not saying anything.
These guys want you to think it was sudden because they want it to look more like magic. They want you to think that's impossible, or at least improbable for...
Actually, no, TMM. If you follow the trend of evolution and what they're trying to get to is that they actually have to speed up the time period. So they agree with us. The explanation, the way they're studying evolution now is instead of saying more time, dude, you're so far behind. You don't even know what your current dogma is. You don't even know your current dogma, dude. The idea that if you just add more time, these things happen isn't even something that's currently held. They're actually reversing that and going, well, we need to figure out how things actually evolve quicker. That's what they're trying to figure out. And you're like, no. More time.
For it to happen naturally, so they can sell you on the idea that God did it. They look for every opportunity to overstate the number and speed of sudden changes.
No, we actually use your math, dude. If you look at the claim of the Pakicetus, the wolf-like dog becoming a whale, you guys grant it 15 million years. That math is not consistent with looking at the same math for what just two regulatory genes evolving. How much time that would require with a fly? 1 million years. Two regulatory genes based on your own math occurring in humans is like 100 million years. And that's the human maintaining exactly its humanness. Just two genes. But you have a whale emerging from a land wolf in 15 million years.
Every time we see innovation, it happens explosively. These are called radiation events. So there are radiation events for the fishes, for amphibians, for reptiles. There are 3 radiation events for birds. There's a radiation event for mammals. And even when human beings come on the scene, there's something called the sociocultural Big Bang, where out of nowhere, this incredibly sophisticated behavior appears explosively. This is completely contrary to what you'd expect from an evolutionary framework.
There's absolutely nothing about this that is contrary to evolution. Sometimes sudden ecological changes can create vastly different selection pressure.
That's a claim, bro. There's absolutely nothing about this that's contrary to evolution. Sometimes sudden ecological changes can create vastly different selection pressures. Yeah? How did you determine that? By the way, you guys don't even believe, this is what I've always exposed about these sneaks. They hold two views simultaneously, and they change between the two. One view is that there's a thing called the environment that somehow provokes the organism. No, that's not even what you guys believe. You guys believe that random mutation happens and it produces some phenomenon that it's either compatible with the environment or it's not. So which is it? He's going to say, well, it's both. I get to choose. When I want to say the environment is prodding at the animal and the animal goes, I'm going to react. I'm going to react to this. Well, no, that's called adaptation. That's epigenetics. That's not what you claim evolution is. And reacting to stimuli in a meaningful way, reacting to the external environment as a creature, assumes that you already have embedded in the organism the ability to do that. Which is it, TMM? You don't even know. Dude, I dare you. I would pay you. I would raise $500 and I would pay you the full $500 to debate me on evolution, TMM. You hear me? $500. I will pay you to debate me one-on-one, moderated platform on evolution. You defend evolution against me.
That drastically alter the organisms in that ecosystem.
You would expect that there would be a proliferation of species, which eventually leads to new genera, which eventually leads to new families, then new orders, new classes, and last of all, new phyla. But we see the opposite in the fossil record. The phyla show up first, and they show up simultaneously and suddenly.
I doubt that's true, but even if it is, it would be their fossils that show up suddenly. They can't show every step along their evolution, and sometimes major...
What's a step? There are no steps. That's the thing. Evolution has to hold that every single moment in time is a step. They just arbitrarily create these fictional ideas in their head that there's steps, while simultaneously holding that every moment between step A and step B has a step, infinite steps in between, and that each infinite step in the evolutionary process has to be equally valuable in its status, but simultaneously not valuable enough to keep. Each step has to justify keeping whatever it has while simultaneously changing what it has towards something that it's not, whether it's a species or even the mechanism itself. So think about the heart. The heart is functional right now, and we know this because if your heart fails and there's a doctor who has a fake heart, he makes a purposeful fake heart. You wouldn't say that the fake heart has no purpose. That would be silly. But you also have to believe from an evolutionary view that there are many millions of years that there were these versions of proto-hearts that operated in some unique way that's similar to the heart, but you can't tell me what they are. And all the steps in between. And that's just a heart. They have to argue this for actual species. That means a species includes all of these diverse body plans, and inside a body plan you have unique particular elements and mechanisms that all work together, that each of those things have to develop their own way through the evolutionary process, and the wholeness of the organism has to develop its own way in the process too. And once you ask them, people like this, you ask TMM if he ever had the balls to go one-on-one with someone, you ask them, can you explain how that happened? I know that you're claiming that it happened, but I would really love, TMM, if you explained how it happened. 1972 Challenger says for $5, how does an eye evolve to be advantageous to an environment a million years in the future? What informs that? Nothing does. It's random from their view. And by the way, they have to give themselves a proto-eye first. How did the eye develop? You ask an evolution proponent? Well, I need you to grant me an eye first. No, it's not an eye. It's a proto-eye. Okay. How does a proto-eye develop? Oh, you need to grant me a proto-eye.
Major geological or climate changes can put sudden selection pressures on the organisms in the ecosystem and lead to vast rapid changes. This could be a factor in the Cambrian explosion and the different species that arose after photosynthesis first evolved and dumped a lot of oxygen.
Wait, did you just say photosynthesis evolved? I'm sorry. That's a new one for me. That's a new one for me indeed. So photosynthesis, the process in which plants and organisms convert light into, that evolved? Yeah, I'm just going to assume another thing evolved in order to explain what you want explained through a process. I just have to tell you another process. I have no idea how it happened. Talk about magic, dude.
Into the air. This is not evidence of supernatural intervention.
So when we see these big explosions of new biological form...
Okay, how does a plant exist in order to evolve to gain the function that's required to exist? Well, you see, photosynthesis evolved in organisms that actually necessarily require photosynthesis to exist. It's always the same shit, dude. Why does this thing have this thing? Because it needs it to survive. Did it evolve to get the thing? Yeah. So it didn't need it to survive. Well,
we now know we're also seeing evidence of big explosions of biological information. To build that form, you need information. It's kind of like in the computer world, where if you want to give your computer a new function, you have to give it new code.
Listen to this, dude. This is the most insane thing I think I've heard from TMM here. Listen closely to what the man says, and then listen to what TMM says. You guys are going to laugh your ass off right now.
Explosions of biological information. To build that form, you need information. It's kind of like in the computer world, where if you want to give your computer a new function, you have to give it new code.
If you want to give your computer function, you have to give it new code, right? No one disagrees with that. Listen to this guy's counter.
Not if it's AI. With AI, you can get new functions with training data rather than code.
Can we just sit with this for a second? This is one of those things I have to play slowly. Okay.
We now know we're also seeing evidence of big explosions of biological information. To build that form, you need information. It's kind of like in the computer world, where if you want to give your computer a new function, you have to give it new code.
Let's just do it real slow. Let's put it on a little slower here, 7.5.
Not if it's AI. With AI, you can get new functions with training data rather than code.
Who trains the data? Who trains it? Who gives it training data at TMM? Who creates AI? The guy arguing against evolution in this case says, oh, look at code. Look at it. It needs code. That code needs a place to come from. That needs intentionality, right? There's some mind behind code. That's what we know about code. That's his argument. TMM says, well, no, not if it's requires a mind like AI, because with AI, which requires a mind, you can get new functions with a mind and intent. To training data, mind required rather than code.
Where does that information come from?
Natural selection. Creationists want you to think that information is some woo-woo spooky phenomenon that can only come from a mind.
You just admitted that it has to come from a mind using your AI example, TMM. You didn't give a counterexample without a mind. And now you're just saying natural selection. No, natural selection is the environment dictating what happens with the animals. Natural selection doesn't give you the information, dum-dum. Natural selection doesn't give you information, dude.
which they also want you to believe is some spooky woo-woo thing. Information is just non-randomness. Mutations are random, but the way they are filtered is not. A common type of mutation is gene doubling. Sometimes 2 copies of a gene will pop up where there was once only 1 copy.
That requires that you have information already.
If one of those copies further mutates, you've got brand new additional information.
No, he's not asking whether or not you think new information can exist. He's asking the origin of the information. $500 I will raise if you debate me one-on-one with camera, by the way.
In the genome. This can result from the ordinary functions of chemistry. No divine intervention is at all necessary.
Information always comes from a mind. In other words, in our uniform and repeated experience, we always see a conscious mind as the source of information.
If you believe that, you don't understand what information is.
By the way, information is immaterial, so let's see what he says information is.
If a rock falls into some mud, the shape of the indentation it makes will match the shape of the rock.
That's not information, that's just raw data, right? And that's granting a lot. No. When a rock falls into mud, dude, and creates an indent, you're already assigning information to it. There's no information embedded in the mud or the rock, dude. Information is theoretical, right? That's why there's information theory. It's theoretical. It's not found in nature.
Consequently, the shape of the indentation in the mud will be information about the shape of the rock.
Nope, aboutness. No. Even your physicalist buddies, your naturalist buddies would know that in the world, the physical world itself has no aboutness in it. There's no aboutness found in the matter itself, dude. You have to do that conceptually. You have to transport the concept and overlay it onto the physical world. Even the word physical world, the phrase physical world or reality. When someone says reality, you know what you say? You say, that's a metaphysical claim, bro. That's what you say. It's reality itself. The phrase is metaphysical. The information that you say is in a book is not identical to the ink and the paper. But according to this Momo, TMM, you're a real Momo. According to him, his reasoning is that the information is identical to the book and the ink, the paper itself, the material paper. And if that was true, this is how wild it is. They're kind of like sola scripturists, but with reality. If it was true that the information is identical to matter, you wouldn't need to interpret the matter. If it was true that the matter itself was the information, we would find Apple, the aboutness, the concept apple, literally, physically, somehow in the apple. Like you dig into an apple and it just like somehow conveys it to you because it's identical to matter. This is such low-tier philosophy from TMM. It's embarrassing.
In such a scenario, information is created without the involvement of any mind at all.
If we see a hieroglyphic inscription, a paragraph in a book.
No. Here's the argument, TMM. Information's conceptual. Even in your example of an imprint of a rock, you're conceptually creating a framework for what an imprint is.
The information embedded in a radio signal.
Radio signals can contain information from natural sources. We can tell if a star is a pulsar from the radio signals it
Nope.
emits.
Nope. Signals themselves, the physical phenomenon, doesn't whisper to you pulsar. A pulsar, TMM, is a categorization of a particular, dude. Is the word pulsar a universal category, bro? Are those found in nature?
Pulsars intelligent because they send identifying information through radio signals?
No, a signal is not found also in nature, dude. There's no signal found in nature. That's a thing you call phenomenon. From your materialist lens, your physicalist lens, the most we could grant you, and not even that, the most we could grant you is phenomena, pure phenomena. But even that is conceptual. That's doing metaphysics. There's no science without metaphysics. There's no science without philosophy. You have no access to the physical world without presupposing something that's not the physical world before you interact with it. This is the lowest tier garble I've ever seen.
Software, any place where we have information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form, it always has arisen from conscious activity, from a mind, not an undirected material process.
So is a rock conscious when it falls into some mud and creates an indentation that contains information about its shape?
It doesn't have information in its shape. Shape is not something found in nature. The word shape, dude, this is so bad. $500, TMM, $500. Shape. Shape is a conceptual framework, dude. There's nothing called a shape that's identical to matter. Shape is a concept we attribute to matter. He's like, information? Where's the information? You're proving Meyer's point, right? Without any minds, would the concept from his atheist position, the concept of shape that describes something, would that exist? No.
What cause now in operation produces digital information? Well, there's only one, and that's a mind.
The word digital seems to be doing a lot of heavy lifting here. I suspect he uses it to dismiss the many examples of non-minds creating information.
No, there's no non-mind that creates information. Look at the definition of information. There's no definition of information that you could use without being like proprietary and completely altering what everyone agrees information is. You'd have to invent your own language, basically, to argue against this. Information, in the general sense, facts provided or learned about something, aboutness. Information, TMM, fundamentally is pointing to aboutness. Objects don't have aboutness embedded in their material. There's no aboutness found in the material. Is there any way to argue that information, that you could know what it is without meaning? And the answer is no. Information requires meaning, but meaning itself is not found in matter. Then information is not found in matter. Simple. You can't find information itself in the material as objects, as physical, because information requires meaning. But meaning doesn't exist under the physicalist lens. It's not found. There's no aboutness. There's no aboutness in matter.
Today, there are a number of biologists that are calling for what they call an extended evolutionary synthesis, meaning that evolutionary theory is incomplete, it's inadequate.
It's not even a theory, dude. I wish these people would actually push back on what a scientific theory is. I wish Meyer would get rigorous. Adding that to his debate strategy, being rigorous on what constitutes a scientific theory. Now, the problem is, because he's a classical foundationalist, he needs the elasticity of a theory to argue for creationism from a scientific lens, which is a mistake. But he needs the elasticity of the scientific theory as a term so that he can develop, quote, theories that are outside the scientific method. Well, no, you shouldn't do that. You should nip it in the bud. You should get super rigorous about what constitutes a scientific theory and what doesn't. And ultimately, it boils down to an experiment. Evolution doesn't fit the criteria. It doesn't meet the criterion for a scientific theory. It just doesn't.
They called a meeting in November of 2016 to come up with a new theory of macroevolution because the current theory they have, this neo-Darwinian theory where you mutate DNA and get a new body plan, they were admitting doesn't work.
They did not conclude that mutation cannot produce new body plans.
Well, that might be true, but it could be true or not true. It doesn't matter. The positive claim for you, TMM, is that random mutation must produce new body plans. Must. When Professor Dave says random mutation produces body plans, that's on them to defend.
So they called all these people to the UK back in November of 2016 to have this meeting, and they heard a lot of people complaining about the current theory of macroevolution, but they couldn't come up with another naturalistic theory as to how these subsequent life forms could evolve.
So it must be magic, right?
Darwinism, neo-Darwinism is dying.
The mutation natural selection mechanism, which has been the go-to explanation for the origin of biological form in evolutionary biology, is insufficient to produce the information necessary to build fundamentally new form in the history of life.
I think what they mean by fundamental is that it has to be the case at the time. So, like, it can't not exist without it. And that really is, if that's the definition that we're going with, in evolution itself as a narrative has a big problem because every stage in development of a new feature, before the feature is realized, for instance, before the heart is realized as a heart doing what it does right now, every step of the way has to be justified as something that's useful, or there's a reason why the organism doesn't lose it, because it would be wasting calories. It would be spending energy that doesn't yield any return. And that has to be true for every single aspect. Eyes, nose, olfactory, brain, ears, hair, heart, liver, spine. Even the spine itself has to grow from their view, has to actually develop from not itself, some other thing. Then, I mean, think about this. This is wild. Like the brain and the spine, how they're connected, from their view, you can't separate the two as far as functionality. So do you have a spine that gets created and just needs a brain? It's just waiting for a brain. It grows a brain for no reason. And all of the pathways, by the way, all the nerve pathways and the networks of communication that happen between the brain and the spine and the rest of the bones and muscles and everything. So you have these super highways of interrelatedness between things that develop separately. That doesn't make any sense. How do you develop interrelatedness and functionality, hyper-specific functionality for things like the brain and the rest of the body that the brain is dictating to what to do? I mean, the things you have to tell yourself to build the storyline of evolution in your head, you have to get really foggy. It's like a permanent blackout. You know, those college kids get blackout drunk. It's like they get blackout drunk, they wake up, and instead of thinking, what did I do last night, they think of the evolutionary theory, and they try to build a foggy representation in their head, and they just run with it. They're like, well, enough time, that makes sense. No, it doesn't.
Even if evolution were true, all it would explain is how one species morphed into another species, and then over time we get the complexity and diversity of life. Evolution doesn't explain why there's something rather than nothing.
No, dude, see, this is a failure on the theist part. That's not ultimately what evolution's going to posit. So you're giving them an out, and TMM, rightfully so, is taking the out. He's like, well, no. From their view of evolution, it's not explaining how it is we have the Earth, something. We're not talking about that. That's a false dialectic, dude. You're actually ruining it for the rest of us who are hypercritical of evolution and their positive claims. Their positive claim doesn't include how the universe came to be from the evolutionary view. That's a bad move, dude. That's a bad move. You don't need to do that. You could say this instead. You could say, evolution is the held belief in a process that's responsible for the variation in life. Okay, let's take that definition. Well, populations themselves are phenomena that's consistent with the changes and variation of life. So it would be necessarily true that if premise one is evolution is the process which to believe causes the variation in life, and premise two is populations are an example of the variation in life, then the conclusion is evolution must be responsible for producing populations. But the problem with evolution, TMM, which is why you probably won't debate me even if I raise $500 for you, is that evolution then necessarily needs to describe and explain the population. But what you guys say is no. Actually, evolution, it talks about variation among populations. So you're admitting, like every evolution proponent must admit, that you need to grant yourself populations.
The factors that is most commonly cited is science. The particular finding of science atheists and agnostics cite most is the idea of undirected evolutionary change, that life arose by an undirected evolutionary process.
He's going to say this, watch. I didn't watch this. He's going to say, well, it's not directed. It's directed by natural selection. Natural selection is the direction. It's like, no, we're not talking about natural selection. We're talking about body plans.
It's not, though. It's
What did I say? Of course. Oh my gosh, you guys are. I wonder if TMM is actually one of the early AIs. It's not, though. It's directed by natural selection. No. We're not talking about. Oh my gosh, these people they're such worms. Just so we're clear and everyone in the chat understands the position. From their view, random mutation is a biological process that produces either workable or unworkable mechanisms in the body, including the body itself, which would be produced by random mutation somehow. Natural selection is the environment dictating whether that thing was suitable for the environment or not. That's not what's in question, dude. We're talking about the thing that gets produced that natural selection makes a judgment on. I'm being colloquial there, judgment. No, it's directed by... No, it's not, dude. You think natural selection produced the... Whether or not... produced the heart? No. Natural selection, from your view, is the outside thing that says, well, you can't survive. Sorry. That doesn't tell me how the mechanisms that natural selection is dictating are advantageous or not came to be.
Directed by natural selection. It's just directed by a mechanism rather than a conscious entity.
Nope, that doesn't explain it. You failed. You failed. You failed. You failed.